Okay, so good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
I'll jump right in, because today we're going to talk about, we're going to look at 1 Samuel 4 to 5. And it's a particular story in the Bible that I think has a lot to tell us. Actually, every Bible in the story has a lot to tell us, but we only have time for one today, so here it is. We're going to look at the first book of Samuel, and the timeline is kind of at the tail end of Judges and just before kingship is set up in Israel. And the main leader is not a king, but the high priest. At this time, Eli was the high priest, and he was supported by his two sons, Hophni and Phinehas. At the time, the primarily big bads for Israel was the Philistines. And the most recent battle between the Hebrew people and the Philistines, the Hebrew people were defeated, leaving 4,000 men dead on the battlefield. Now, contemplating their devastating loss, the survivors come up with a new plan. Here it is. When the people came into the camp, the elders of Israel said, "Why has Yahweh defeated us today before the Philistines? Let's take the ark of the covenant of Yahweh from Shiloh, so that he may come among us and save us from the power of our enemies." What's wrong with this picture? Can you see the problem? Right, this is just one sentence, but it really packs a punch. They're suggesting an extremely dangerous proposition. First of all, you don't mess with the ark. It housed the presence of God. People died just by touching it. It was supposed to remain in the tabernacle behind the curtain, viewed only rarely by the high priest. And yet somehow they justified dragging the ark out of the tabernacle and marching it into war. They feel like they can march the presence of God into war without consequence. Oh, how wrong they were. Do you see what they're doing? They're mimicking their enemies. The Philistines marched their gods into war and they won. So if they copied the Philistines, maybe they'd win too. In other words, they're treating Yahweh, the creator of the universe, like a pagan god. God to them is a poster boy for their agenda. They want to be saved by God, but what they really want is to win. They want dominance and power for themselves, and they want God to give it to them. Did they pray for assistance from their battle against the Philistines? No. No. There's actually a running theme in the Bible of seeing, desiring, and taking. Right? It starts in the Garden of Eden. Eve sees the apple, she wants it, she takes it. In Genesis 6, the sons of God see the daughters of mankind, want them, and take them as wives. In Genesis 34, Shechem saw Dinah, desired her, took her, raped her. In Genesis 37, the jealous brothers of Joseph see him, wished he was dead, tossed him in a pit to die, and took his coat. In our story, the Hebrew people saw the Philistine gods march into battle, they desired success, they took the ark into battle. Let's march Yahweh into battle with us. There's no way we could lose. However, here's the lesson. Their agenda was not God's agenda. Surprisingly, though, when we read the account in the Bible, it almost starts to sound like bringing the ark into battle is a good idea. Here's what we read. As the ark of the covenant of Yahweh was coming into the camp, all of Israel shouted with a great shout, so that the earth resounded. And when the Philistines heard the noise of the shout, they said, "What does the noise of this great shout in the camp of Hebrews mean?" Then they understood that the ark of Yahweh had come into the camp. So the Philistines were afraid, for they said, "God has come into the camp." Now, this is kind of interesting. The Philistines recognized that the Hebrew God was amongst them. How did they feel about that? They said, "Woe to us, for nothing like this has happened before. Woe to us. Who will save us from the hand of these mighty gods? These are the gods who struck the Egyptians with all kinds of plagues in the wilderness." This is like those, they're terrified, right? They understand that the God of the Hebrews, in their own terms, polytheistic, many gods, who will save us from these mighty gods? And they recognize that these gods, or God, was powerful. The gods of the Hebrew people devastated Egypt with 10 terrifying plagues. They remember this. This was years and years ago, but they remember. And this God is in their camp, their battle camp, ready to destroy. They're terrified, but they refuse to run. They stood their ground and fought. Take courage and be men, Philistines, or you will become slaves to the Hebrews, as they have been slaves to you. So be men and fight. It's like those big movie battle scenes, like Braveheart and Aragorn and Lord of the Rings. Yes, we may be outnumbered, and we may be the underdogs, but stand your ground and fight. And guess what? Their bravery works. 30,000 Israelite soldiers die on the battlefield, including Hophni and Phinehas, the sons of the high priest Eli. Not only does the Hebrew camp lose, but the Ark of the Covenant is captured and taken from them. The Philistines see the Ark, they want it, and they take the presence of God into their territory. See, want, take. This is complete devastation for the Hebrew people. When a messenger goes to Eli the high priest to tell him of the results of the battle, we get a picture of just how horrible this is. The messenger tells Eli that they lost the battle with 11,000 soldiers dead, and he is deeply saddened. Then he tells Eli that his sons are dead, and Eli is understandably devastated. But when the messenger announces that the Ark of the Covenant was captured, Eli falls off his chair and dies. The news literally kills him. His whole theology is shaken. How could they lose with God on their side? Was Yahweh not as powerful as the pagan God? And you see, these are questions that pop up into your head when you start to view God like a pagan God. We don't know if these were Eli's thoughts, but losing God to the enemy killed him. It broke his heart, literally. His faith was shattered, and he died in his disbelief. The question is, was God on their side? Or was there something bigger going on? Was this war God's war? Did anyone consult God? Were there prayers asking for guidance? No, they just marched him into war without asking. And this is the danger that we all face. How many times has the Christian church historically marched God into war? How many times have we made him the poster boy for our agendas? Have you seen the God hates you signs that are marched around abortion clinics and AIDS centers and government buildings? Is this how we're supposed to show love to the world? And we have to be careful. We have to be very careful what we're dragging God's name into. He is not a poster boy for our agenda, and when we do that, we're treating him like a pagan god, marching him out like an idol to make us feel better about our opinions and ourselves. It's very dangerous. And I fear that the more churches treat God like a pagan god, the quicker the Christian church will go wildly off the rails. And I'm not saying that's us here, but how easy is it for us anyone really, to slip into that danger zone? Many churches in the southern U.S. are already there and have been there for a while. Now, before we go down that wild rabbit trail, let's go back to our story. The Ark of the Covenant has been captured by the Philistines. The presence of God has been removed from the Israelite people. And where does he go? Now, the Philistines, who believe in multiple gods, add him to their collection of gods. The chosen people treated God like a pagan deity, and so that's where he goes. Yahweh's taken to the temple of Dagon in the Philistine seaside town of Ashdod. You can see it along there. So they started off in Shiloh, they fight in the Ebenezer area, it goes down to Ashdod with the Philistines. The ark is placed beside Dagon. Dagon is one of the chief gods of the Philistines. He becomes part of the Philistine god collection, so to speak. He's another idol on the shelf. But don't we do the same? Don't we put God on the shelf and take him down only when we think we need him? We're treating God like an idol when we do that. But does God behave like an idol? Oh no, no, he does not. We read 1 Samuel 5, 1-5. Now the Philistines took the ark of God and brought it from Ebenezer to Ashdod. Then the Philistines took the ark of God and brought it into the house of Dagon and placed it beside Dagon. When the Ashdodites got up early the next day, Behold, Dagon had fallen on his face to the ground before the ark of Yahweh. So they took Dagon and set him back in his place. I love this story. I kind of feel that God had a good time here. Oh, you want to add me to your collection? Oh, okay, this should be fun. And you can imagine the priests getting up the early next morning and seeing Dagon bow down in front of the Ark of the Covenant, right? And the Hebrew people in the presence of Yahweh is there, and they'd be like, oh no. And they quickly scrambled to get Dagon back on his feet before anyone could see this embarrassing situation. Phew, that was a close one. But it wasn't done. It happened again. That's Ash today. When they got up early the next morning, behold, Dagon again had fallen on his face to the ground before the ark of Yahweh. And the head of Dagon and both palms of his hands were cut off. And on the threshold, only the torso of Dagon was left. This time God's not messing around. Like Dagon bows to the feet of God, headless and handless. This is a bold statement. So your God has no power in the presence of Yahweh. None. Now, this is interesting. How did the Philistines treat their enemy in battle? They decapitated them. It's also been suggested that they removed their arms as well in order to kind of render them powerless and unable to survive in the afterlife. There's a little bit more research needs to be done on this, I think, but regardless, God's message to the priests of Dagon was clear. There's no life in your God. I have dominion here. We read this. There's a rendering of the concept. For that reason, neither the priests of Dagon nor any who entered Dagon's house step on the threshold of Dagon and Ashdod to this day. The high priests recognized the authority of the Hebrew God, and they recognized that the space where Dagon fell was under the dominion of Yahweh, the God of the Hebrews. That was God territory, and they would never risk stepping on it. That's amazing when you think about it. There's this temple to gods, to pagan gods, and there's a space where they're like, no, we can't go there. The God of the Hebrews is in charge of that spot. We're not risking that. It's the kind of victory that God brings. It wasn't about killing in the battlefield. It's about creating God's space in the midst of chaos. It's wandering into enemy territory and making them recognize his authority as the God of all gods. The priests of Dagon understood the awesome power of Yahweh, perhaps at this point even more than the Hebrew people did. God was making a statement to the followers of Dagon, but he was also making a statement to the Hebrew people. Do you think marching me into your battle is what victory looks like? No. I'll show you what victory looks like. It's when evil falls at my feet and recognizes my authority. I alone can make that happen, and I don't need you to decide who my enemies are. Now, the original worry of the Philistines that this was the God who brought infestation and plagues to the Egyptians was a legitimate worry because it came true for them. As the story continues, and I suggest you read it this week, it's a really interesting story, the ark remained with the Philistines, and when it did, they broke out in disease, and the Philistines gave in, and as well as a rat infestation. And eventually the Philistines are so run down that they give in and send the ark back to the Hebrew people, along with an offering of gold, images of rats and tumors. It's like they're saying, take it back. We'll even pay you in gold to keep this away from us. If God was going to be marched out, he would be marched out on his own terms and claim his own victory. So then, what does God need us to do? You know in Genesis how we read that humans were made to be in God's image, right? Every single human was made to be an image bearer of God. Not a potential image bearer, but a full-blown image bearer. And the Hebrew word for image and idol are actually the same. Idols, like statue of Dagon, bear the image of gods, but Yahweh created humans to bear his image. God was against creating idols, like Dagon, with wood and metal, because he already had created his own idols to bear his image, humans. We're to be God's reflection on earth. Every human is an image-bearer representation of God. It's just that some reflect God more poorly than others. But we don't have the right to judge anyone because we think we're doing a better job than they are. We're all God's image bearers. That's why Jesus spent so much time with the undesirables of his day, right? He was building an upside-down kingdom where the weak and the meek rise to the top, where victory doesn't look like war, but it looks like a blind person regaining his sight. This story that we've just been reading is just a few short years away from the people demanding a king like the other nations had. And God was disappointed because they didn't recognize him as their great king. But he gave in. He let them have what they wanted. And for the most part, it was a disaster, right? Because those leaders didn't reflect God's intentions. Their interests lied in power and in pride and in domination. But Jesus is the true king that God sent. And what does his leadership look like? Well, let's look at his coronation, which we're leading up to in the next few weeks. Jesus was lifted up not onto a royal coronation throne, but onto an execution rack. Crowned, not with a crown, but with a circle of thorns. Toasted, not with wine, but with sour vinegar. He wasn't cheered, he was mocked. They didn't bow at his feet, they nailed his feet to wood and told him to stand still and die. They shouted at him, "If you're the Son of God, come down from the cross and save yourself." But he refused to show his power and his dominance because that's what earthly kings did, and he was far from an earthly king. He had a mission to save, and to do that, he had to fall before he could rise. So as I talked about a few weeks ago, I'm back in school, so this is one of the things my professor, Dr. Heiser, says, and I like how he puts this. To defeat death, you need to have a resurrection, and you can't have a resurrection unless you die. God is a humble, loving, self-sacrificing God who would die to save us, and that's what a true king looks like. What we as humans expect from the great creator of the universe is not what we get. And we have no right to demand that our expectations be his expectations. God knows what he's doing, right? And he will claim the victory whether we're with him or not. But he does victory his way, and we're just along for the ride. He has his job, and we have ours. We kind of want to play God ourselves, right? And expose our enemies and make our agenda God's agenda. But that's not our job. Our job is to follow the greatest commandment. Matthew 22:35-40, a lawyer asked Jesus a question, testing him. "Teacher, which is the great commandment in the law?" And he said to him, "You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your mind. This is the greatest and foremost commandment. The second is like it. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. Upon these two commandments hang the whole law and the prophets." Everything hangs on this. If you don't get love, don't get that love is at the center of the story, then you're not going to get the story of the Bible. Our job is simple. It's to shock the world with love and compassion, even to those who don't deserve it, especially to those that we think don't deserve it. That's what being in God's upside-down kingdom looks like. You find the worst and you bring them the best. Remember the theme, the see, desire, take? Jesus changes it to see, have compassion, give, right? We're saved by his love. But others will only get there by seeing the love of God in action through us. How can others see God's love through us? That's a big question we ought to ask ourselves individually. And we ought to ask ourselves as a church family. We should never make God a poster boy for our agendas. We are his poster children. We are his image bearers. We are his idols to reflect love and kindness and compassion on this very broken world. I think we as a church should get together. I think we should get together and discuss what that looks like. Because if we don't, we could be missing out on our calling. Our community doesn't need us to march into war, but our community does need us. And what can we do to help? What can we do to show God's love to our neighbors outside of these walls? It's something to think about. With that, let us pray. Yahweh, God, we call on you. Help us to stop marching out as if we're in war and instead march out in love. Instead of tearing people down, help us to lift people up. Help us to listen and to respond to those in crisis and in need. Help us to show others what you, God, look like. You are a God who saves, you are a God who heals, and a God who loves unconditionally. Thank you for being that kind of God for us. In your great name, amen.